Good morning. Welcome to our webinar. I'm Diva Scoville. I'm the Associate Manager for Programs here at Urban Green Council, and I'm excited to welcome you all to our Local Law 97 Unpacking the Proposed Rules 2024 update. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to our Urban Green Council values. They are excellence, inclusion, collaboration, and engagement, and we ask that you keep these in mind as you participate in our webinar. I'd now like to hand it over to the CEO of Urban Green Council, John Mandyke.
Okay, Diva, thank you very much. Welcome to everybody that's joining us today. We'll just give you a few seconds here to everybody to file in. We're so excited that you're joining us today. Today we're joining the Department of Buildings to unpack the latest Local Law 97 implementing regulations. There are very important provisions that you're going to get briefed on today that will continue to make this world-leading law successful. So we're excited to hear all the updates today. We have more than 1,200 people registered for this webinar, and it's part of our commitment to be your go-to source for all things building decarbonization related. So I really want to thank Laura Popa and the team that you're going to hear from today for their work on these issues and for joining us to share the updates with you. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Chris Halfnight, who's going to be our moderator today and the Senior Director for Research and Policy at Urban Green. So Chris, over to you.
Thanks so much, John. Good morning, everybody. As John said, I'm Chris Halfnight. I'm Senior Director of Research and Policy here at Urban Green Council. I'm really excited to have so many of you in the audience today and thrilled to have the sustainability leadership from the New York City Department of Buildings and Department of Housing Preservation and Development to brief us on this major third installment of the Local Law 97 rules. Our plan today is to spend about 30 minutes on a presentation from our panelists, giving a detailed overview of the content of these proposed rules. Then we'll move to about 10 or 15 minutes of moderator questions. Those include questions that you all as the audience submitted in advance. And then lastly, we'll have about 25 minutes of live Q&A based on questions submitted through the Zoom chat box. So during the webinar, please put your questions in the Zoom Q&A box and also upvote questions. You can click on the little thumbs up sign next to any questions, and questions that get more upvotes will be more likely to be posed in the live Q&A. So with that, I'm going to ask our panelists to go ahead and turn on your cameras, and we will get started on the webinar. Excellent. So joining us today, we have Laura Popa, who is Deputy Commissioner for Sustainability at the New York City Department of Buildings. We also have Jennifer Leone, who is Assistant Commissioner and Chief Sustainability Officer at the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, or HPD. We have Emily Hoffman, who is Director of Building Energy Emissions Performance at DOB, and Beth Golub, who is Director of Sustainability Policy and Legal Matters at DOB. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today and for their leadership on Local Law 97 implementation. We really couldn't have a better team to walk us through these rules. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Laura, to kick off the presentation.
Good morning, everyone. A big thank you to Chris and John and all of our partners at Urban Green for hosting this webinar on the latest proposed rule package. So for those of you who have participated in other information sessions over the past year or so, you've seen this next slide before in one form or another. It's our timeline. It's a good review of the progress the city has made implementing Local Law 97. So since the law was passed in 2019, the city convened an advisory board that met for 3 years before issuing a report, and DOB has relied on that report when engaging in rulemaking. We published guides for Article 320 and 321 buildings, and 2 major rule packages have been adopted. Last week, we published the third and anticipated last major rules package that will be considered before the first compliance report is due. That doesn't mean we won't do more rules. It just means there won't be any major packages before May 1st, 2025. Most of the buildings who have to comply with 97 have a report due at that time, but there is a 2-year delay for certain buildings that have less than 35% rent regulated units, and that's shown on this timeline. And then certain income restricted buildings like Mitchell-Lamas don't have to start complying until 2035, also indicated on the timeline. So as a reminder, the law was drafted and the emissions limit were set so that the top 20% of emitters need to reduce their building emissions during the first compliance period. We know that a significant percentage of these buildings have already moved into compliance, about 50% of them. And obviously emissions are lowered in the second and subsequent periods, and many more buildings at that time are going to have to do work to comply. So the city's focused on supporting owners to achieve the 2030 limits, as well as continuing to support those owners that still have work to do in 2024. Next slide, please. So this is a reminder of the compliance buckets. On the left, you have the Article 320 buildings, which have to reduce emissions by retrofitting through 2050. They can also purchase offsets, which we will be discussing today, as well as RECs when they become available, potentially in 2026. There are about 34,000 Article 320 buildings. In the center, you have the Article 321 buildings. They have a lower cost one-time compliance obligation. They can meet all applicable prescriptive energy conservation measures, or they can comply with the 2030 emissions limit in 2024. So these buildings, about 10,000 of them, have more than 35% rent regulated units, or they are houses of worship where 50% or more of the space is classified as occupancy group A3 religious house of worship. Finally, on the right, you have the city-owned buildings. They must achieve portfolio-wide reductions that are a little more aggressive than the 320 buildings, and there are about 3,500 of these. So we have a covered buildings list, a CBL that can be found on DOB's website, and there's a hierarchy detailed there for buildings that fall under more than one article or compliance date. So obviously we encourage every building owner to consult that list. Next slide. So this summarizes the rules DOB has already promulgated and includes the resources available to support those rules. So Rule 103.14 covers Article 320 buildings. It includes guidance on how to calculate and report emissions, the penalty framework for non-compliance, and this is both respect to submitting the compliance report and for failing to achieve the required emissions reductions. The penalty framework also provides for opportunities for mitigation, as directed by Local Law 97. These include what constitutes good faith efforts, like doing a long-term decarbonization plan, and it establishes a process for mediated resolutions. With a mediated resolution, a building owner will commit to a particular course of action to reduce emissions, and DOB will be allowing more time for compliance. Rule 103.14 also covers a credit for beneficial electrification. And that means that building owners who undertake even partial electrification measures will be rewarded with a credit against their emissions limit through the first 2 compliance periods. Rule 103.17 covers Article 321 buildings. That includes guidance for inspection and documentation of the PECMs. There are penalties for non-compliance in the rule, as well as the mediated resolution process and mitigation opportunities similar to the 320 buildings. Both rules have information and filing guides, and those are available on our website. And I believe these slides are going to be made available, and there are links on the slides as well. Next slide. So this list reflects the proposed package of rules. They include offsets, which is represented by an affordable housing reinvestment fund, the 320.7 adjustments required by Local Law 97, which represents both external and financial constraints. There's a carbon coefficient for biofuels that aligns with EPA standards. There's a pathway for cogen to operate as long as it is cleaner than the grid. There are filing fees for the compliance reports, and there's some cleanup. Next slide. So this is the first part of the package we're talking about, and it establishes an offsets program. So as a reminder, Local Law 97 authorizes offsets for 10% of a building's annual emissions limit. And under the law, the offsets must be, among other things, measured in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, purchased, publicly registered, and retired. And they must exhibit environmental integrity principles. Here's a list of core integrity principles established by the feds for voluntary carbon markets. These are reflective in our program, and under these principles, the offsets must be real and quantifiable, permanent, additional. So the additionality means that the offset projects have to support activities that are not already required to reduce emissions under any law. The offsets must be verifiable and unique, and any baselines for emissions reductions must reflect robust baselines and rigorous methodologies, which Jen will be talking about momentarily. So we looked at the requirements of 97, and we looked at the established environmental integrity principles, and we developed an offsets program called the Affordable Housing Reinvestment Fund. And in the press, someone gave it a catchy name, the Greenhouse Fund. Next slide. So the idea of an affordable housing fund has been around for a while, but it was originally conceived as a fund for penalties, right? That arguably presented some legal challenges. But the Affordable Housing Fund was supported in testimony submitted on Local Law 97, and it was a recommendation of the Local Law 97 Advisory Board. So the important principle is that the city needs dedicated funding to advance deep decarbonization in affordable housing. And the city is, of course, committed to equitable decarbonization for low-income households. It's stated in the Housing Blueprint in Plan YC. So what the proposed rule does is it marries the idea of an affordable housing fund with an offsets program. It creates a pathway for building owners to comply with Local 97 while also ensuring that low-income buildings have the resources they need to decarbonize. And most importantly, the decarbonization occurs right here in New York City. So emissions are reduced here citywide, and the health and the climate and the economic benefits are local. The money stays right here in New York City. So I'm going to turn it over to Jen Leone from HPD to explain more about how the offsets program is going to work in practice.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Laura. So this is how the program will work. You can see on the diagram, a building subject to Article 321 of Local Law 97 can, as Laura described, purchase offsets to cover up to 10% of their emissions limits. The dollars go into the Affordable Housing Reinvestment Fund. This is administered by a third-party administrator who acts really as a pass-through to manage the flow of funds. Once the owner purchases the offset, they receive a receipt to demonstrate that the offset has been purchased. The purchase is then recorded and then encumbered to an HPD electrification project through our new READY program, which I'll talk to on the next slide. And these are buildings that are not subject to Article 320 emissions limits. The purchase is then retired in the registry. It can only be used once, right? 1 ton of emission reduced. And then the project is built. Emissions reductions are verified by an independent third party. That would be NYSERDA in this case. And the registry is updated. Next slide. So the READY program. This is a newly announced program that is the successor to our highly successful retrofit electrification pilot program, where we provided funds to beneficially electrify more than 1,300 households in HPD's reservation pipeline. Again, this is a joint HPD-NYSERDA program. We really are focused on beneficial electrification, specifically of affordable housing. And what the program does is funds electrification of heating and hot water systems using high efficiency heat pumps, and also requires that buildings are doing energy efficiency work alongside of electrification for the best outcomes. And the program really prioritizes the dirtiest buildings and the buildings with the greatest needs. Ready projects are subject to significant oversight, both by HPD and NYSERDA. And that is important because it ensures that the scopes are designed to reduce emissions and that there's full oversight of the scopes from design through implementation. And this is really important because we need to guarantee the outcomes that we are promising through the program. Ready has a very large pipeline of very good electrification candidates, but it's important that we have this offset funding, right? Because this ensures that we are not turning away low-income buildings where electrification is really hugely beneficial and provides health, safety, and climate benefits to the lowest income households. And as Laura said, the program is going to help us reduce emissions locally and also help us meet New York City's climate goals. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology. We wanted to create a methodology that would meet all of the principles of environmental integrity and really make sure that every offset purchase will yield a ton of emissions reductions. First of all, the purchase price is $268 a ton. That was very intentional. We want to be sure that buildings are doing the decarbonization work they can. And I'm talking about the buildings subject to the emissions limits. This is really to get buildings that last mile of hard to decarbonize emissions. The offset value I'm going to talk about. So every HPD electrification project we've calculated as offsetting 3 to 5 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's over, we're calculating 20 years because these are permanent projects. We are removing the fossil fuels systems that they're replacing. And that variation is based on the baseline fuel type we're converting from and the size of each dwelling unit that's being decarbonized. These calculations were based on assumptions that were vetted by NYSERDA and compared against other sources. And finally, it's important to note these are incremental greenhouse gas reductions compared to what these projects would be doing otherwise. And finally, the funding levels will be set according to the methodology above to make sure that we're appropriately scaling funding to emissions reductions. So the funding amounts are different based on a building's base fuel type. So an oil building yields greater emissions and will be funded at a different level than, say, a gas building. And the funding is scaled to unit size, which is something that we do in the READY program already. I am going to turn this over to whoever is talking about adjustments. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Beth Golub, Director of Policy and Legal Matters in the Sustainability Bureau here at DOB. Happy to talk about these new adjustment programs that we are that are included in this proposed rule package. So these adjustment programs are in the law, Section 28320.7. The first is in the event that a building has an external constraint, including another provision of law or a physical condition of the building that prohibits the building from achieving compliance with the emissions limit. So the proposed rule describes that an application for this adjustment to the emissions limit would include a description of everything the building has done to come into compliance already, and a technical description of how the law or physical condition prohibits the building from achieving full compliance. The law also requires that these buildings will have availed themselves of all available incentives for energy reduction work, and that the buildings have to purchase the maximum amount of offsets and RECs if available. So we are expecting very few, if any, applications for this adjustment program in the first compliance period, while emissions limits are still relatively high. And then there's the adjustment for financial constraints. So the proposed rule describes that the application for this would include confirmation that the building has engaged with the accelerator to identify a scope of work needed to achieve compliance and availed themselves of all of the incentives for that work. And then the building can have a certified public accountant demonstrate that it meets one of the appropriate standard that signals that it is indeed in significant financial distress. And before we get into the details of those standards, there is also an opportunity for buildings, as outlined in the law itself, that have been included on the city's tax lien sale list for 2 years in a row to apply for this. And that's separate than the standards. And these buildings will also, as the law requires, that they will have availed themselves of all the available incentives and that they have purchased the maximum amount of offsets and RECs if available. Okay, next slide. So DOB worked with lenders and finance experts to develop these standards, which account for different ownership and finance models of different building types. So for condos and co-ops, those buildings will have to demonstrate that the annual costs for owners for each unit have gone up on average 5% above the rate of inflation over the prior 3 years. So the average increase in costs over 3 years is 5% higher than the average rate of inflation over those same 3 years. And this would demonstrate that there has been a significant increase in costs for these buildings such that they can't afford the work necessary for compliance. For nonprofits, those buildings will have to show that they've had negative revenue less expenses for 2 years in a row. And this is actually language that is included in the law in Local Law 97. For buildings with an affordable housing regulatory agreement or that have no debt that are owned free and clear, these buildings will have to demonstrate an income expense ratio less than 1.05. And this is a metric that's been used by HPD and HDC as a threshold that's equivalent to the debt service coverage ratio. And that brings us to the final standard for all other buildings. These buildings will have to show a debt service coverage ratio less than 1.15. The debt service coverage ratio is an industry best practice used by lenders to determine if a building is in good financial health. Okay, I think I'm passing it over to Emily.
All right, thank you, Beth. So I'm going to cover a couple of different topics that are also in the amendments to Rule 103-14. The first one is we have defined biofuel and established a coefficient for commercially available biofuels. So biofuel in this case means biodiesel and renewable diesel. We added a carbon coefficient that aligns with the EPA standard, as you can see on the screen. This coefficient is comparable to the coefficient for fuel oil. And this is just, this standardizes the coefficient, for biofuels. We still have the ability, we still preserve the ability that if there is a manufacturer that's creating a biofuel that performs better than this coefficient, they can come to the department and propose what that coefficient would be with methodology and outlining the methodology they use and providing us backup documentation. We're currently working on a guide to outline what we would look for when we do a review on that methodology if we were to approve a different coefficient. Next slide. We also have added an alternative pathway for legacy cogeneration systems. So this is for cogeneration systems that existed prior to September 1st, 2024. Existed means filed with DOB, filed an application with DOB. And, we determined, this methodology, we had a working group of experts and stakeholders earlier this calendar year. We convened that. It was comprised of government officials from New York City, NYSERDA, U.S. Department of Energy. The utilities were involved. Con Ed was involved. And also engineering firms and owners of cogeneration systems. So we came to consensus on how to approach these legacy cogeneration systems that currently operate better than the electric grid. And just high level what cogeneration system is, it's a system on site that consumes fossil fuel and produces electricity that's used by the building or a campus. It also has a byproduct of heat. So what we have set is that if this system meets three criteria, the criteria one, that it existed prior to September 1st of 2024, two, that it meets a minimum operating efficiency that is better than the current grid conditions. We've set this in the rule as 55% efficiency, so it has to be at least 55% efficient or better. We're also putting in guidance how to determine that efficiency. It's based on, it aligns with the NYSERDA incentive program that has been available for, the last decade. So once it meets that operating efficiency, it also has to meet a maximum NOx limit that is also aligned with recent NYSERDA and Con Ed incentive programs for these systems. We do have some specific exceptions for that minimum operating efficiency for certain, for certain either building types. Those are critical facilities. Critical facility is defined in the rule. Those are, essentially hospitals. There's also an exception to this minimum operating efficiency for systems that are in areas that are designated by DOB with unreliable and or inadequate grid generation capacity as verified by Con Ed. So these systems may change, these areas may change over time, but right now it is the Brownsville and Jamaica substations. So it's buildings that are served by those substations. And essentially what this alternative methodology does is instead of, it basically allows, it allows the building owner to use the coefficient for what is generated by the system. So for the grid electricity that is produced, that electricity can use the grid coefficient, and the byproduct of heat would use the steam coefficient, and that's in lieu of what is consumed with the gas. And the reason we're allowing this is these systems operate better than the current grid. And so again, we had a working group of experts, and this is, the methodology that we landed on. The 55% threshold, that minimum operating threshold, is equated to the grid. We've done analysis on this and through the working group, and it aligns with the analysis that MOCEJ does on Zone J and how the grid is actually performing. So we compare the two, and as renewables enter the grid, that minimum operating efficiency will increase, and this alternative methodology is expected to phase out by 2030, as long as the grid, aligns with what is currently in Local N97. Next slide. We also established fees for both Local Law 88. You see that's the first line here. And we have several different fees for Local Law 97 compliance reports. For the annual emissions reports, that's the Article 321. The fee is based on basically how simple or complex the report is. And these costs were determined and are aligned with how much administrative work it will take DOB to review these reports. So you see a good faith effort report is a higher fee. That's a very detailed application and detailed review. An extension, there's extensions available for 320. For the affordable housing, the Article 321 buildings, those also have a lower fee for those one-time reports. However, if a building's pursuing mediated resolution, that would be a higher fee. And then, as Beth mentioned, on the adjustments for 320.7, the external constraints adjustment has the highest fee. That will be a very involved application for us, as we're going forward. So look for those in the, in the fee roll. Next slide. This is a legacy generation. So this is a correction to an existing formula that was in Rule 103-14. You'll actually see, if you're looking at the rule, it's affixed to 4 formulas, but it's essentially it's the same factor that's being adjusted. And the thing that we're changing is that we are allowing systems that currently operate better than the grid to account for any electricity that is sent into the grid. So if this electricity is generated on site, it's cleaner than the grid, and say the entire building isn't utilizing it, or it's a campus that's not utilizing it, this electricity can be sent back to the grid and the owner can be accounted for that. So we just want to recognize that this is now can be accounted for. Next slide. All right, so this slide is shifting totally off of Local Law 97 to Local Law 87. And just to remind all of you, if you're not familiar with Local Law 87, this is our energy audits and retrocommissioning rule. For buildings over 50,000 square feet, they have to report once every 10 years. If the report is late, the penalty for the first year is $5,000, and any subsequent year after that first year is another $3,000. So what we're changing in the rule for Local Law 87 is related to the penalties, is that we are not requiring those outstanding penalties to be paid before we collect the report. So what that means is, it doesn't mean the penalties are wiped clean. It just means that we'll stop accruing the penalties. We'll accept the report. We want the information in the report, but we're not holding up that submission before the penalties are paid. So that's one change. And then the other change is that we are adding a new credential for qualified energy auditors. This is the Energy Management Professional certification offered by the Energy Management Association. So those are 87 changes. Next slide. All right, and I'm passing over to Laura.
Thanks, Emily. So what are our next steps for implementation on Local Law 97, just really in general? So we're going to advance the rulemaking process. We have a hearing scheduled for November 7th at 11 o'clock. We're going to consider all testimony, of course, and then we'll publish the final rules, soon thereafter. Once the rules are finalized, we're going to post updates in the Article 321 information guide, anything we need to publish in the 321 filing guide. We're also going to have new separate guidance on offsets and separate guidance on the 320.7 adjustments related to the external and financial constraints. Finally, we are in the process of developing, and obviously have to finish developing, the Local Law 97 reporting portal. We're going to be testing that portal with some stakeholders. And to talk a little bit about what that portal looks like and information that's going to be required in that portal, I'm going to turn it back over to Emily to close out the presentation and let you know about BEAM.
All right, thanks, Laura. Next slide, please. So the reporting portal for 97, we will be using the Building Energy Analysis Manager, or BEAM platform. Beam works on top of the seed platform that was developed by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab in conjunction with U.S. Department of Energy. It directly connects to information from EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager. And brings it together in one platform. So this is where we're going to receive all of our compliance submissions. That includes the annual emissions reports for Article 320, the 320.7 adjustment applications, and the Article 321 compliance reports. Just to note, Article 320.8 and 320.9 adjustment applications are in DOB now. If you have not yet and still want to file that adjustment application, you need to go in DOB now. So like I mentioned, the Beam platform accesses data from Energy Star Portfolio Manager, and it will also access information from DOB Now. So what this means for the industry is that you will need three accounts. You'll need a DOB Now account to pay for your filing fees and any penalties if they are owed, an ESPM account. And so we'll still be getting the automatic utility data through ESPM. And then you'll also have to have a Beam account to connect the data from both of these platforms together into the Beam platform. What's great about this platform is that it automates most of the calculations. So this would be the emissions limits, based off of the property type areas, and also the annual emissions. That would be automated. We will be providing templates for certain, deductions and credits. If they're not automatically built into there, we will have a separate template for you to fill out where all of the, supporting documentation would live. For example, like a time of use calculation, and then that information would be uploaded and input into the Beam platform. It also allows for any owners, representatives, service providers, RDPs, or retro-commissioning agents. They will go in here, they'll input any additional reporting information beyond the Energy Star Portfolio Manager data. They'll upload supporting documentation, and we're working on a brief right now that is outlining what that would be. Every application will need to have an attestation from both the owner and the service provider, and that will, then that report will be submitted to DOB. Additionally, all of the DOB enforcement will happen, like the auditing reviews will happen within the Beam platform, and all of the communication will also happen within that platform as well. It can communicate per application out to the building owners and service providers. The only thing that, as far as enforcement that will not happen in Beam is that penalties and payments will happen in DOB Now. And so, like I mentioned, we're working on a brief that we will be publishing on, essentially this outline, but much more detailed on what we're looking for and how the process will work in more detail. We're looking to publish that in the next 2 weeks. And then, this would become obviously available next year for everyone to report. We will have a lot more information forthcoming on this. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you to all of our panelists. That was a super helpful, very informative overview of all the details in the proposed rules. For our audience, I just want to note, Laura mentioned it, but we've seen some questions in the chat on whether the slides will be shared. They will be shared. They'll be available on the Urban Green Program website after the webinar. And also a reminder to put questions in the Q&A box and upvote questions you'd like to see posed. There's lots coming in, so keep them coming. And with that, we're going to move to our question and answer portion of the program, and I'll ask all of our panelists to come on camera, please. Great. So to kick us off, I want to ask a relatively high-level question and direct it to you, Laura. And it's essentially that rulemaking, I think for many, is a bit of a black box. There's a lot of detail, a lot of technical detail, and maybe minimal understanding of what goes into developing it and shaping it. Can you talk a little bit about the process for DOB in developing these proposed rules and how you go about it and what sort of input helps shape the outcome?
Sure. So, I mean, basically, we've been working on these rules since the law was passed, right? And that starts with the advisory board process. And that's been informing all our rule packages And in particular for this one, the advisory board, as I mentioned, wanted an affordable housing fund, right? And so we kind of married that with the offsets program. And the advisory board wanted to make sure the offsets, were kept in New York City, et cetera, and the benefits accrued here. So it's been ongoing for a while. Also, for the offsets, we presented to the Environmental Justice Advisory Board, the city's board that is under MOCEJ. The law directed that we do that. We work with city agencies like JENS. We work with NYSERDA. We had to work with OMB, right? So there was a very long internal process to get that established. And of course, with Urban Green, because that's been the big priority for Urban Green over the past several years to get that done. For the adjustments, like Beth said, we worked with, in particular for the financial adjustments, we work with lenders and financial experts, because we really wanted to land on what's the industry best practice. And for the cogen, as Emily said, we had a working group with experts and stakeholders in that, utilities, Con Ed, to come up with an appropriate approach for that. And then, it's the CAPA process is ongoing, the rulemaking process, the CAPA process. So we'll have our hearing. We expect, feedback constantly, not just, formal feedback at the hearing, but, after and during this, presentation that we'll be taking into consideration. So kind of, it's like a bunch of things. And it's been a very long process to come up with all of the rules to be ready for May 1st.
Fantastic. A very long process indeed. Let's turn to the Affordable Housing Reinvestment Fund. As you said, this is a piece Urban Green's very excited about. Jen, you gave us a really nice overview of the details. We've gotten several questions in advance on the third-party administrator, and a couple have come up in the chat. I think there's some confusion around who the third-party administrator is and what's the role, given that it seems like the vision is HPD is primarily administering the retrofits. So can you speak a little bit about who this third-party administrator that's mentioned in the rules is, what the role might be, and why not keep administration in-house?
Great. That is a great question. The primary role of the administrator is it's really a pass-through entity, right? If you imagine if this program's successful, there'll be a lot of checks from a lot of building owners coming in that have to be tracked and recorded. Somebody's got to hold the money until it gets distributed into HPD's retrofit projects, right? So the administrator is serving that specific role, which is not something that HPD would be particularly good at. On the flip side, if you remember that diagram I showed, the outgoing funds and how they are used are entirely administered by HPD, right? The projects are overseen by us. The projects go through our normal processes and have this oversight by NYSERDA and our own teams, right? So that the administrator, that third party, is really doing just a tiny piece of the work that is truly administrative. It was the best and most cost-effective solution to handle this. Even if we were to try and run it through HPD, we would have had to staff up to manage that money flow. So that was not a sensible way to do it. I can't talk about who the administrator is until there's a contract in place, but it's somebody that has done work with the city and can offer this service. And again, this is a tiny, tiny piece of the overall program, but it just makes sure that the paperwork does what it needs to, and the money does what it needs to.
That makes good sense. Thank you. One more question on the Affordable Housing Fund and offsets piece. I think there's also been some focus around the term offsets, and there's somewhat checkered history for traditional or conventional offsets for things like tree planting. Many have worried about whether those are real, verified, permanent, additional. You touched on this on the slides, but can you return to it and just explain a bit further how these emissions reductions and these offsets are different, how we know will be real and verified, and what guardrails we have against manipulation or shortfall?
Sure. Another great question. So HPD, if anybody who's in the audience has gone through an HPD development project, there's a lot of oversight, right? We take on a project, work with that team on all of the aspects of design and financing, all the way from when a project comes into the pipeline until it's completed, right? So we know exactly what a project is doing. In this particular READY program, we also have an additional layer of oversight through this NYSERDA funded technical assistance provider. So every project coming through the program, we know their baseline conditions. We see their integrated physical needs assessments. We know what the buildings have to do. And we are very connected with and have a lot of oversight over their scope development, right? These projects are required to electrify their hot water and space heating. So we know, right? We have calculators, lots of tools, and a lot of expertise to be able to project in the early days and the early stages how much emissions a building would be expected to offset, right? So we know that. We know the size of the building. We know exactly what they're doing. And then we have oversight of the scope so that before any money changes hands, we know that that scope is confirmed. We know that design meets our very stringent technical requirements. And then even throughout the construction phase, the technical assistance provider is overseeing that this electrification equipment gets installed, follows all of our QC protocols, and so on. So no money will ever leave hands without being affiliated with a heavily overseen electrification project. At the end of the project, all of our projects are required to benchmark. So we'll know on the back end and vet that the emissions reductions are happening in real time. Obviously, that happens after completion. But we believe that our projections were very conservative and that, the outcomes that we're guaranteeing should easily be met.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful perspective. We'll come back to the fund, I'm sure. There's a number of questions in the Q&A box, but I want to turn over to the adjustments, in particular the financial adjustments. So Beth, this one's for you. We did receive a number of questions about the specifics of the financial adjustment metrics and their impact and how they were set. You touched on it again a little in the presentation, but can you share a little bit more detail on how those metrics were developed and the philosophy behind them?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris. So, as I described, and as Laura spoke to also, we worked with lenders and finance experts to identify not just appropriate models or factors to consider for a particular building type, but also to set those standards so that they reflect industry best practices for buildings that are indeed facing such financial distress that they can't afford to do the work right now. So the standards are designed to appropriately capture those buildings that are in that state of not being able to afford additional costs, and also to do so as the economy and other variables impacting a building's finances change. So, and for condos and co-ops in particular, that model, their financing model would have them basically at a debt service coverage ratio of 1. So that best practice doesn't work. But common charges and maintenance fees are a regular costs that are regularly raised to cover expenses and any debt incurred. So owners can expect those costs to increase, and they can look to inflation as a rate of increase that can be reasonably expected. But when an increase is 5% above inflation, and when that's above the reasonably expected increase, and when that increase is 5% above inflation 3 years in a row, it means that the regular rate of increases is now 15% above inflation for 3 years. And unlike commercial buildings, these are buildings where the owner's investment is their home, right? So significant increases year over year make it such that the owner might not be able to afford living in their home. We think this captures a significant state of financial distress for those buildings.
Thank you, Beth. That's really helpful. We did get a couple questions about the percentages, and so I just want to repeat what you said to make sure I've got it right. It's not a 5% increase over the 3-year period above inflation. It's a 5% annual average increase above inflation over the 3-year period, meaning it's 3 years, and totaling, as you said, if it was 5% above every year, you'd be totaling 15% by the end of that 3-year period. Is that correct?
That's right. It's the average increase over 3 years is 5% above the rate of inflation, the average rate of inflation over those same 3 years.
Got it. Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to kind of blend into the audience Q&A that's coming in live via the Q&A box. As I turn to you, Emily, with a couple questions about cogen. So as you said, there's a new methodology being proposed in these rules for cogeneration systems. These are systems that generate electricity on site and also produce waste heat or excess heat that can then get used in the buildings for heating or cooling. Um, let's maybe start first with just a foundational question. You touched on it, but I think you gave a detail on how the metrics work. Maybe it would be helpful to frame why the addition of this new methodology based on system outputs instead of just the gas pumped into a cogen system. And I know this has been an area of interest for owners of cogen systems like hospitals, and also concerns around grid management from the utilities. So if maybe you could contextualize that a little bit, that would be helpful.
Yeah, sure, Chris. So, these systems, like you said, they work by they consume fossil fuel and they're producing electricity on site and heat as a byproduct. So essentially, if these and right now, most of these systems are operating cleaner than the grid, right? They have to demonstrate that they're meeting that, at least that efficiency threshold that aligns with the grid conditions, and then they can use this alternative methodology. And so the reason why we went with this approach, and this was, as I said, the consensus among these stakeholders that we had on the working group. So if you think about this cogen system that's generating this electricity on site, if it were to be shut down, the building would have to connect to the grid and get that electricity directly from the grid. And so what we're incentivizing right now is to keep the cleaner generation on site and, essentially assume, the methodology assumes that they would just be tapping into the grid instead of generating it on site. And we're only allowing them to do that as long as what they are generating is cleaner than directly connecting to the grid. I hope that clears it up.
It does. Thank you. And I guess one more question that's come up a couple times in the Q&A box on cogen is there's a few of them touching on the longer term plan. So is there a plan to kind of what's the evolution of this approach? Is there an incentive for these buildings to come off of cogen in future? Can you touch on the sort of post 2029 vision?
Sure. So, I mentioned in the slide that, this is anticipated to phase out around 2030, but the caveat there is that the grid also has to clean up and perform better than the coefficient that is currently in Local Law 97 for 2030. So it's very possible that if enough renewables do not enter the grid and generating electricity on site is cleaner than tapping into the grid, then this timeline would be extended. So it's all contingent upon what is reducing greenhouse gas emissions at the building.
Great, thank you. Let's turn back to the Affordable Housing Reinvestment Fund and the offsets. There are a number of questions in the Q&A box on the pricing. And we heard it's set at, or will be set, the plan is to set it at $268 a ton for the offsets. That is above the typical market rate for offsets. It's equivalent to the maximum penalty under the law. Can you, and I really open this to the whole panel. I know you were all involved in developing this proposal. Why price at $268 a ton? What's the rationale? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, Chris, I'll take that. So, you know, the premise or the primary goal of 97 is to have buildings reduce their own emissions, right, at the building level. So if you set the price of the offsets at the cost of the fines, that's going to support the goal. The first thing that a building owner is going to do is reduce their own emissions, right? And then on top of that, if we're establishing, you know, a program that will fund deep electrification, deep decarbonization in affordable housing, then the credits of doing that have to be priced accordingly, right? We actually need then to do the work. And so the 268, which mirrors the penalties, which were set based on doing work in the buildings, right? Back when in 2019, when Local Law 97 was passed, that cost ensures that we're going to have an effective offsets program for affordable housing.
Thank you, Laura. Let's turn to another question that's getting a lot of upvotes in the Q&A box, and that's on low and moderate income co-ops. The question is, do these proposed rules aid low and moderate income co-ops in reaching Local Law 97? Can you speak to that? And if these rules don't so much, maybe broaden the lens a little bit and how DOB and the city is thinking about help for low and moderate income co-ops.
Sure, I'll take that too. So I'm not sure the exact angle this is coming from, but in order to qualify for the offsets, you have to be an HPD program in affordable housing. There may be low income co-ops that can be in that program to qualify to receive offsets. But let's assume not moderate income co-ops, right? So another way that we feel these rules support those buildings is in the standard set for or proposed for receiving the financial adjustment. And we're looking forward to hearing testimony from interested parties and stakeholders on that issue. And then I would say that in general, we've definitely approached this issue as we want to work with building owners, right? Not penalize them, and building owners who are making efforts, et cetera. And so we have built in the rules already from previous rule packages, the idea of doing a decarb plan, getting a little more time, if needed, et cetera. We have Accelerator, which, is the free service. Call NYC Accelerator. They'll help a building walk through finance options, including incentive options. So this is a very important, even to do the adjustments, you need to work with Accelerator, right? That's like a key principle of getting the adjustments, and because you have to have applied for all available incentives. So the city is constantly looking to see how can we hook basically owners up, low and especially low and moderate income co-op owners, with incentives, with financing, and we've done our rules in a way that we feel like it responds to how we can be flexible in working with those building owners over time, because it's not, just about today, it's through 2050, et cetera. We understand that it's a long game. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. Let's go to a couple somewhat more logistical questions. There are a number of questions in the Q&A box touching on the reporting portal. Do we know when that portal will be available, and if there will be, there was a question about workbooks or guidance on formats or fields before the full portal launches. Can you speak to the timeline for that?
Sure, Chris, I'll take that one. We're aiming to finish up all testing by the end of this calendar year and have the the portal available early in 2025. We will be doing extensive outreach on the portal with detailed webinars, step-by-step guides. One thing I didn't mention about the portal is that there's a help desk that is embedded within the Beam platform. So we're looking to streamline a lot of the questions that we get. So all of that will be coming in early 2025.
Great. Continuing on the more logistical theme, there are a couple questions about simple versus complex reports. Can you walk our audience through that, please?
Sure. And the thing I mentioned about putting a brief out on the reporting platform is also going to touch in detail on the difference between simple reports and complex reports. Simple reports is essentially one building on a BBL that is not taking any sort of deduction or credit or has a shared energy system. It's, just directly applying directly calculating the limits from the property types and the emissions from the annual energy usage. That's a simple building. Essentially, everything else is a complex report. Sorry, it's simple report, complex report. 321 does not have the same distinction. That's only for Article 320.
Great. And then we also did get a couple questions about the fact that there are kind of 4 separate notices for the rules, and really this is logistics around commenting, but the proposed rules did come out in 4 notices. There are 4 unique comment submission pages. They're available on the city record website and the city rules website, as I understand it. Does it matter where comments are submitted, and can they be aggregated? Do you need to disaggregate and submit comments to the proper notice portal, or is that sort of an unimportant detail, and you can just kind of get the comments in and that works? Or do we not know?
I can speak to that. No, comments submitted anywhere. We're checking all of the um, repositories for comments every day. So you can comment in the city rules website. You can send a comment to DOB rules at buildings.nyc.gov. And you can tell us the rule that you're commenting on, and we'll be able to allocate it appropriately.
Great. Thanks, Beth. That's helpful. Going back to the Affordable Housing Fund, there's a couple of questions about um, the eligibility for Article 321 buildings following the prescriptive emissions limits. Are they eligible for potentially eligible for the offsets? Can you speak to that, please?
I can take that one. You were cutting out a little bit, so I'm going to try and answer what I thought I heard, which is, are buildings subject to Article 321 eligible to receive the offset funds? Chris, that is what you asked, correct?
Well, sorry, I think my internet connection went unstable for a second there. Hopefully you can hear me now. Let's do both. Are they eligible to receive the funds? And if they opt into an emissions limit pathway, are they eligible to use the offsets for compliance?
Great. That's a good question. And Laura, please jump in if there's anything you want to add. So Article 321 buildings are eligible to receive the funding if they're coming through an HPD program and through our READY program. We work with a lot of Article 321 buildings because obviously they're mostly affordable housing. On the flip side, a building subject to 321 is not technically subject to Article 320 emissions limits. They may elect to comply with Article 320 emissions limits for the 2030 period, but we wouldn't expect somebody would purchase offsets to do that. And it wouldn't be, that would not be an option to purchase offsets for those buildings.
Okay, thank you. Turning now to, sorry, I'm just glancing through the Q&A box here. There's a lot
Sorry,
of folks.
Chris, can I just jump in? I think we might need to consider that one offline, and we'll send a note around about the ultimate response.
Okay, great. Yeah, that makes sense. It's fairly in the weeds. The question, another question that has quite a few upvotes on the Q&A box is a little bit broader than the scope of these rules, but it's a continuing on this Article 321 building themes. Is there a plan for Article 321 compliant buildings to further decarbonize, or will they never have to do so? Can anybody speak to that more broadly?
If the question relates to, is there a, plan to mandate that? Not that I'm aware of. I can't speak for the legislature, for the city council. Right now, our focus is on getting 321 buildings to comply with 97, and hopefully through the 2030 pathway, and to participate in 321 Go program, and the offsets program, the Ready program, and Jen can speak to anything else that's available to those buildings. But there's there, I think what the question asked was, is there a mandate on the way? And not that we're aware of.
I think that's a very fair answer. There are, of course, as you were alluding, a lot of city and state and federal programs and dollars flowing to help those buildings and all buildings decarbonize. And I think at the highest level, to reach our long-term decarbonization targets, we certainly want to see more action in those buildings, but that's maybe for a later day. Let's go back to the adjustments. We didn't really touch on the other adjustment category, which is external constraints. Beth or anybody, can you offer any insight on the types of conditions that might be eligible for the legal or physical constraint adjustment?
Sure. So, one category of buildings we've considered pretty closely is buildings that are subject to landmark preservation guidelines. So there might be some type of requirement there that ultimately prohibits the building from reaching net neutral carbon emissions. But we've worked closely with Landmarks, and they have also updated their guidelines recently to make efficiency work, easier to do and to happen more quickly. So it's that type of thing. A building might be subject to the zoning resolution, or something of that nature.
Great, thank you. A couple questions coming in on staffing, both DOB and HPD. There's of course work involved to administer these types of programs, and this has come up in some prior hearings at City Council. And just checking in on, I know the team's been growing, and would love to hear any insight on how you all are thinking about adequate staffing for implementation of these rules, in particular the Affordable Housing Fund program.
I'll speak to DOB. We are very happy with staffing, with the money we received in the executive budget. We had 32 new lines, and we are well on our way to hiring all of those lines. And on top of that, we have a $20 million grant with Urban Green and NYU, which puts a couple more technical people on staff through that grant, that federal grant, over a 6-year period. So, and my understanding, and Jen could correct me if I'm wrong, is since it's already the HPD, ready pipeline, there's not a staffing up for the offsets program on HPD's end. Is that correct, Jen?
Yes, we purposely designed this to integrate into a program we're already doing. If it's wildly successful and, the program is huge, then yes, it wouldn't take a whole lot more to expand it, at a really great scale. But we really expect that we can handle that with the staff and the technical support that we have. It aligns perfectly with HPD's mission.
Fantastic to hear. Maybe bunch together a couple questions on the offsets and affordable housing fund. that should be relatively quick to answer. One is, are the offsets available annually? I may have cut out there for a second. The question was, are the offsets available annually? And also, when do you anticipate they will become available?
So the offsets are annual as per local law 97. They have to be purchased annually each year that a compliance report is submitted. We expect that they will be available for purchase before the report is submitted, the compliance report, because in part you'll be saying, I purchased these offsets here. Here's my compliance report potentially, and that will be in early 2025.
Great, thank you. And then the funds heading towards low-income buildings, does it include NYCHA buildings or private buildings paying for NYCHA buildings? And another question about, do the offsets need to be purchased every year?
So again, they do need to be purchased every year. If a building owner wants to take that pathway, and they're only for buildings that the additionality means they're only for buildings that don't have to reduce emissions under local law 97 already. So they're for 321 buildings or affordable housing buildings that aren't covered at all by local law 97. So that would be the biggest one is buildings under 25,000 square feet that are affordable housing buildings. It's not going to be the city's portfolio of buildings because they have to reduce, NYCHA has to reduce building emissions under local law 97.
Great. And then one last question on the funds flow there. There's a question saying, did I hear correctly, the penalties will not go into this fund? That would provide more revenue than the offset program. Why not? Can you speak to that?
Yes. So all penalties have to go into the city's general fund as per state law. So there is not a state law that has established a special fund for penalties for local law 97. So that is why.
That makes good sense. And then we're getting close to time here, so let me wrap up with the resources-oriented question. We've covered a lot of ground. A lot of this is quite technical. There's, of course, much more specific detail in the proposed rules themselves. But where can our audience get more information? What resources and assistance are available and where?
So we have our website, and we have, recordings of webinars posted there. Accelerator is a fantastic resource with the same thing with, trainings, etc., postings there. Of course, the guides are all available. We've done and continue to do webinars with ASHRAE on different aspects of local law 97 implementation. Those are ongoing. There's a library of those, plus, anyone can join, one of those going forward. We continue to be out in the community. And if, we have our greenhouse gas emissions email that anyone can send questions to, and, we're responding as quickly as we can. We have FAQs that we put up. So it's kind of a broad cornucopia of resources for people to access.
And if
Excellent.
I can jump in. Oh, sorry.
Please.
I just want to note that if you Google HPD sustainability, there's a lot of information on that page, everything about our READY program, links to our electric heating policies. That's come up a few times lower down in the Q&A, what we're doing at HPD and so on. And more information, of course, on other HPD programs are on the HPD general website. Last thing I will say is the DOB did release a really good Article 321 filing guide, and that specifically has pretty much everything you need to know about Article 321. And I think that's an important resource because it speaks to so many questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jen. If we could bring the slides back up, we've reached the end of our webinar today. I want to remind everybody that these are proposed rules. These are in process. They are open for public comment until November 7th. You can see on the slide here how to go about submitting public comments or registering to speak in person virtually at the hearing on November 7th. I want to thank everyone in the audience today for joining the webinar and submitting your questions. We will do our best to follow up with any questions that weren't answered in the live Q&A. And then I want to thank our esteemed panelists again. These informational sessions, which we've done a couple times now, are really a great service to all the stakeholders in our space who are interested in these rules. And I want to thank all of our panelists for your tireless effort and leadership on Local Law 97 implementation. Urban Green Council is a mission-driven nonprofit. Our mission is to decarbonize buildings for healthy and resilient communities. We are a member organization. If you're not a member, go to our website and see how you can join. And I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletters, to follow us on social media, and support us in any way you can so we can keep bringing you topical, insightful programs like this. And I want to thank you all.
Hi, this is Danielle from Urban Green. I'm just going to fill in for Chris right here at the end since his internet is cutting out. Thanks everyone for joining us today. The webinar will be posted online on our website and the slides will be there too for everyone to reference. Have a good day.